Okay, I think we have stabilized the number of people that are here. Maybe others join later, but welcome everyone. This is the monthly webinar series on carbon dioxide removal, organized by us at the CMCC. I'm Daniela. I'm a scientist at the CMCC, and I'll be sharing a short presentation about what this webinar series is. And then we're gonna jump in the theme of this webinar with our great panelists and speakers. So this webinar, it happens every Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. on Central European Time. It's an online event, but the registration is required. So if you already are registered, you're going to be receiving always the reminders. And if it's the first time we're joining, remember to follow us and always follow the news on the webinars, the future webinars that are very interesting, where we share the news from the most recent news and developments on the CDR field. This webinar is organized by the Industrial and Planetary Carbon Cycle Program at the CMCC and is part of the UPTAKE project. So moving on, about CMCC, we are a leading research center focused on understanding the interaction between climate change and society. We are located in Italy, and we are about 450 researchers and staff across 3 institutes and 3 centers. And as you can see in the map, we have offices all over Italy. Our institute is the one that organized this webinar, is located in Milan, and it is the Institute on Economics and the Environment. But we have 2 other institutes, as you can see here, the Institute on Climate Resilience and the Earth System Predictions. And we also have 3 cross-cutting programs, one on the global coasts and the other on predicting socioeconomic impacts of climate change. And the last one is the one that organized this webinar, which is the ICC one, the one that we are part of. And about the UPTAKE project, the UPTAKE project is a EU-funded project. It started in September 2023, and it has a total of 4 years, involves more than 20 institutes across Europe. And as part of this project, we have this UPTAKE CDR forum, where it's a platform that helps different stakeholders to engage. So if you want to be part of that, if you want to follow the news on the project, if you want to engage with all the stakeholders that are part of our project, follow this QR code, and then it's going to take you to a short Google form, and you can join the forum and start to interact there. Just one reminder now, we, as part of UPTAKE project and with the CMCC, we are also organizing this 4th International Conference on Carbon Dioxide Removal, which is formally International Conference on Negative CO2 Emissions. We decided to change the name this year. It's going to be 10 to 12 of June 2026 in Milano at Politecnico. And the abstracts are already open. The deadline is January 30. So if you follow this QR code, you can go to the page to submit your abstract. So please do that if you're interested in being part of great discussions that are going to happen there. And with further ado, I want to introduce the webinar today, which it's going to be a very interesting, timely, and topic. That's the biodiversity implications of land-intensive CDR. The speaker, which is the lead author of this paper, is Ruben Prutz from PEC, and our panelist is Sabine, also from PECS and also a co-author on this paper. And I'm going to be moderating the discussions today. And just a reminder, your audio is deactivated during the webinar, but if you want to submit questions, you can ask them here in the Q&A. And stay tuned for the next webinar that's going to be on January 14th. And with that, I can pass the floor to you, Ruben.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniela, for this introduction. Let me share my screen. And now we can jump right into the presentation. I'm very happy to have the chance to present this ongoing work today. As Daniela already said, in this work, we focus on biodiversity implications of carbon dioxide removal, specifically land-intensive carbon dioxide removal. And this is ongoing work that we are conducting together with several different colleagues across the UPTAKE project, but also beyond UPTAKE, several researchers from different European institutions are involved. And as part of this presentation, I want to give you a snapshot of some of the preliminary results. But before I do that, I thought it might be useful to start to clarify a few concepts and terms. I think many will be very familiar, but might still be helpful, so I will quickly run through them. So essential to our analysis are mitigation scenarios, which we assess. Mitigation scenarios are internally consistent future pathways, and these pathways, they outline how emission reductions across different sectors, or also how the absence of emission reductions may affect the climate. And with such scenarios, we can then explore how we could still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees of warming. But such scenarios can also be used to explore what kind of warming implications we would see with the current level of policies. These scenarios, at least the scenarios that we are working with for the study, are produced by integrated assessment models, IAMs. What are IAMs? These are very large computer models that connect different system components, such as, for example, economy, the energy sector, transportation, the land use sector, but also importantly, the climate. And in these integrated assessment models, there are different tools or different options, different strategies that allow us to decarbonize. And one of these options, or like sort of a category of these options, is carbon dioxide removal, CDR, the core concept of our study and the core theme, the core topic of the UPTAKE project in general. And I guess, yeah, people will be familiar with this, but CDR comprises all human activities that actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere and then store the CO2 in other carbon pools, such as in land sinks, in the ocean, or in geological formations. There is an array of different CDR options that are being discussed in the literature, but in our study, we focus on two of these options. First, we focus on afforestation, reforestation, and natural restoration. Collectively we refer to these options as forestation. And these options have in common that they aim to increase global forest cover to store more carbon in the biomass in forests, but also in the soils below forest. And then in addition to forestation, we also consider bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, known as BECCS, as part of the study. And in a BECCS setup, biomass feedstocks are used for energy production. During the energy production, CO2 is being released, but before the CO2 then enters the atmosphere, it can be captured and stored in geological formations. And by this process, we can then produce energy and achieve negative emissions. And these two CDR options, they have in common that they are very land intensive, at least in some of the setups. And that's why we focus on them, because this has biodiversity implications. But more specifically about the context of our study, when we look at the latest assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, we can clearly see, or the report clearly states, that by now CDR deployment is unavoidable if we want to achieve ambitious climate targets. This is the case because we will need CDR to counterbalance hard to abate emissions, so emissions from sectors that we will not be able to decarbonize in the next couple of decades. But we will also need CDR to potentially reverse warming in the context of temperature overshoot. So overshooting the 1.5 target, which is becoming more and more likely due to insufficient emission reductions in recent years. Then the same assessment report from the IPCC also highlights or assessed several scenarios, referred to as the AR6 scenarios. And these scenarios show how we could still limit warming to 1.5. And these scenarios quite heavily rely on the two CDR options that I already introduced, specifically forestation and BECCS. So the scenarios suggest that these options need to be part of the solution to achieve long-term or to limit long-term warming to 1.5. Then lastly, also from this report, we know quite clearly or with high confidence that these two options may also have negative implications for biodiversity. So they need to be part of the solution for climate action, but due to the land-intensive nature of these CDR options, there may also be negative biodiversity implications, depending on the mode of implementation. And this then motivates the aim of our study, which is to assess existing IAM scenarios concerning their CDR-related implications for areas of high biodiversity importance. Now I want to give you a bit of an idea of the study approach that we took here. I won't go too much into depth. I just want to highlight kind of the data sets that we used here. And basically for our study, we combine different existing spatially explicit data sets. We use two different categories of data sets. On the one hand, we use spatial scenario data, and the scenario data comes from different integrated assessment models. Specifically, we have data from 5 different models, and these data sets, they show us for different future time steps between now and 2100, and also for different scenarios of different ambition. For these scenarios, the data sets show land allocation for forestation and for BECCS. And these spatial data sets we can then combine with the other category of data sets, which comprise information on biodiversity. Specifically, in terms of biodiversity, we focus on 2 data sets. The first data set comes from the University of East Anglia and shows us climate refugia maps. So what are climate refugia? These climate refugia maps show us the climatic suitability of a very large ensemble of terrestrial species. So in this ensemble, we have roughly 135,000 species across different taxa. So this includes plants, animals, insects, and fungi. And these maps are then resolved for different warming levels between 1 and 4.5 degrees. And that means that for each of these warming levels, we can see whether a particular area, global area, is still climatically suitable for our biodiversity ensemble or not. And therefore, climate refugia is sort of a resiliency indicator that shows to what extent different areas can shelter species from the effects of climate change. Then, in addition to this climate refugia data set, we also consider biodiversity hotspots. And these hotspots, they don't tell us something about the resiliency of species, but they tell us something about species richness. So the amount of species, the richness in different places, and also the levels of endemism. So whether there are especially rare species that are only found in some places and not in other places. And here we rely on the common AR6 definition, so the IPCC definition, which combines global ecoregions and hotspots for conservation priorities. So then in addition to the climate refugia and biodiversity data, we have more data sets that we consider that sit more on the IAM scenario side. So we consider global warming levels and CDR deployment rates. We retrieved this from the AR6 scenarios database. And specifically, we focus on the shared socioeconomic pathways and representative concentration pathways. What are these scenarios? These are widely used mitigation scenarios. And here we specifically focus on 3 of them, specifically one scenario that is in line with current policies, so that would limit warming to around 2.8 degrees of warming throughout the century. Then we have a more ambitious scenario which limits warming to below 2 degrees. And then we have a really highly ambitious scenario that would limit warming to still 1.5 degrees of warming in the long run, however, by now with overshoot. And for the same set of scenarios, we then have the land use maps that show us the land allocation for forestation and bioenergy cropland for BECCS from the 5 different models, as I already said before. With that, I won't dive too much more into the methods. Basically, what we do is we combine the different spatial data sets to learn something from the overlap. And now I'm going to move on to some of the preliminary results. And I will start with the global picture and show you this first panel in which you can see the share of remaining refugia, so the sort of the extent of climate refugia that would still be present, that would still exist for a certain warming level and a certain time step across the 3 scenarios. And then for this remaining refugia, you can see how much would be allocated for CDR deployment. In the left column, you see the land allocation results for forestation, and in the right column for BECCS. And the different rows show you the results for 3 of the 5 models that we consider. So for AIM, GloBIOM, and IMAGE. And just from looking at this plot, you can see that the blue scenarios, so the more ambitious scenarios, they have higher shares of land allocation for CDR deployment within refugia. This is simply because these are the more ambitious scenarios. They rely more heavily on CDR and therefore also require more land within refugia compared to the red scenario, which is in line with current policies. So less ambitious, therefore relies less on CDR, but would also mean more warming and more warming-related refugia loss. If we then compare the 2 columns, we can see that generally there's higher land allocation in refugia for forestation compared to BECCS. There are some differences across the models, but I will talk more about the differences of the models in a minute. Then still sticking to the global picture, we can then also explore how the land allocation for CDR within refugia is distributed across different country groups. Here we look at the UNFCCC Annex 1 countries. These are mostly high-income countries. And the non-Annex 1 countries, these are mostly non-high-income countries. And here you can see that across the 3 models, we can see that there's higher land allocation in refugia in non-high-income countries. And this, of course, raises questions of fairness and burden sharing, because many of these non-high-income countries, they are only very little or have very little responsibility for causing climate change. And therefore, it raises the question whether these countries can and also should carry the burden of CDR deployment. So far, I've mainly talked about the land-related implications of CDR. But the purpose of CDR is, of course, to limit peak warming or to reverse warming, so to mitigate warming, and therefore CDR is also a warming effect because biodiversity is also sensitive to warming. And here in panel C, you can see sort of the net effect that we would expect to see CDR to have in the assessed scenarios for climate refugia. And the net effect is basically the combination of avoided warming, so this is good, minus the land allocation, so that we assume to be more on the negative side. And here in the plot, you can then see that if the values are positive, then we assume net benefits. If the values are negative, then we assume, or then we see net harm. And just again, from looking at this plot, you can see that there's quite some uncertainty due to the large spread in results. We see that there's potential for quite some net benefits in the extreme case, but also potentially net harm. And this, of course, raises the question, why is this so uncertain? This has a lot to do with assumptions that we have to make about biodiversity's ability to recover in the context of overshoot. If we assume that biodiversity will be able to recover to some extent, then CDR may prove highly effective. But if we assume that biodiversity will not recover from peak warming once temperatures start to decline, at least not in the foreseeable future, then CDR may be much less effective from a avoided warming perspective, but this definitely requires further scrutiny, and there's still room for improvement to better understand biodiversity implications in the context of overshoot. With that, I will move on and give you a few more insights into the regional picture. Here in this plot, you can see the land allocation for moderate CO2 removal levels. Specifically, here we assume 3 gigatons removed through forestation. This you see in purple, and 3 gigatons per year removed through BECCS. This you see in orange. And 3 gigatons is really more like on the moderate to lower range of the spectrum of deployment in scenarios. But still, with these moderate removal rates, we can see that there's already quite some land allocation across the different models. Again, we can see that the models differ quite a bit. We see this even more clearly if we look at the results aggregated to the country level, where you can see the share of national refugia that would be allocated for forestation and BECCS, assuming a combined removal of 6 gigatons. And here we can really see that in some cases, more than a quarter of the remaining refugia areas in countries would be allocated for CDR deployment, while in other countries, the allocation of national refugia is much smaller. But given this large uncertainty, or like the largely different land allocation fingerprints across the different models, we also explored model consensus to better explore where models agree or don't agree. And this you can see in this map, where we look into model agreement where at least 2 out of the 5 models that we considered agree. So the 5 models are AIM, GChem, Globiome, Image, and Remind Magpie. So 5 widely used modeling frameworks, and at least 2 out of these 5 model frameworks need to agree on land allocation to be plotted in color in this map. Here you see the results for forestation, and in color you see the model agreement within remaining refugia. And what we can see is that there's quite some agreement in Eastern Asia and parts of China, partly also in the US. And if we then also take into account more contextual information on the ecosystem history, so specifically whether the land allocation would occur in pristine ecosystems such as grasslands or in savannas, or whether it would take place in degraded ecosystems, this information allows us to make an assessment, or at least indicate whether the overlap between CDR and biodiversity may be more on the positive side, so potentially beneficial, this you see in orange, or whether this overlap would be likely harmful, this you see in red. And just from looking at this map, you can see that there are some areas where we see potential benefits, but also quite some areas where there might be negative implications. And this picture is even more stark if we don't look at forestation, but at BECCS. This you can see in this map, and here you can really see that there are many areas lighting up in red, meaning that in these model consensus areas, we expect to see mostly negative implications for biodiversity. This is the case, for example, in parts of the US, in several countries in Western Africa, but also more dispersed in parts of Southeast Asia and also South America. So far I've mainly talked about CDR implications for biodiversity conservation. However, we can also take the reverse perspective and explore how biodiversity conservation, specifically biodiversity conservation goals, may affect CDR deployment. And here we looked into the global biodiversity framework, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. What is this framework? This framework is sort of the Paris Agreement for nature. And one of the goals of this framework says that the loss of areas of high biodiversity importance should be brought to close to zero by 2030. So no land use change in areas of high biodiversity importance. What areas of high biodiversity importance are is not so clearly defined, and therefore we work with different exclusion criteria to explore how much less land for CDR would be available in the scenarios if we were to exclude different biodiversity areas. This you see in the 3 columns here, where we first excluded current biodiversity hotspots, then we excluded climate refugia, and ultimately we excluded a combination of these both biodiversity areas. There are some different results, but basically what we can see from looking at this plot is that if we were to exclude current biodiversity hotspots from land allocation, more than 50% of the land that is being allocated in the scenarios for CDR deployment would not be available. It's important to note here that this does not mean that 50% of the CDR is not feasible. It mainly means that CDR would need to take place in other places. So for example, in less cost-effective areas, and this could also increase the pressure on food security or, for example, land tenure. What we also see from looking at this plot is that this issue may actually arise already relatively early. We see that already in 2030, substantial shares of the land that is being allocated in the scenarios for CDR deployment would not be available if we strictly enforce land protection and if we do not allow for land use change in areas of high biodiversity importance. Here it's important to note that we excluded all the areas to comply with the goal in the Kunming biodiversity framework, but one could also explore how the picture would look like if we were only to exclude, if we only wanted to exclude areas that would be harmful for biodiversity. So not all areas, but just the negative areas. And if we only exclude the potentially harmful areas and still allow CDR deployment in biodiversity areas that could benefit, then we see that there's a reduction. So there's still more land available, but still substantial shares of land allocation would not be feasible, still more than 40% in the case of current biodiversity hotspots. So with that, I want to move on and close with a few key take-home messages. From the global analysis that I showed you, we could see that quite substantial shares of remaining climate refugia may be allocated for CDR deployment. In the case of forestation, this would be up to 11% of remaining climate refugia. For BECCS, the overlap is a bit lower. Around 4% of remaining climate refugia may be allocated in 1.5 compatible scenarios. But I think it's important to note that even like 4% could be quite substantial if we consider that already a biodiversity loss of 5% could lead to catastrophic outcomes. So even if the numbers may seem small, the implications may still be large. Then we also see that the effects are quite unevenly distributed across different regions. At least for forestation, we can see that there are markedly higher land allocation shares in climate refugia in non-high income countries compared to high income countries. And this, as I said before, raises questions of fairness and burden sharing because the land allocation in many cases would occur in countries that are least responsible for causing climate change and are therefore also less responsible for taking the burden of climate action and potentially also less capable of carrying the burden of CDR deployment. What we also saw is that CDR has quite some potential to reduce warming-related loss. So I think it's quite important to know that CDR could also bring co-benefits, especially in terms of avoided warming, which is helpful for biodiversity. But here it's important to note that this potential is quite uncertain and has a lot to do with assumptions about biodiversity's ability to recover from an overshoot. This is still a very active area of research, and more work needs to be done to better understand biodiversity implications in the context of overshoot and CDR deployment. What we also saw is that biodiversity conservation may affect CDR deployment, so not just effects from CDR deployment on biodiversity, but also the other way around. And if we were to exclude, for example, current biodiversity hotspots, then more than 50% of the scenario-based land allocation for forestation and BECCS would not be possible. As I said before, this does not mean that 50% of the CDR that we need to do is not feasible. It mainly means that we would alter our land allocation patterns, resort to potentially less cost-effective areas to save biodiversity, but it could also mean that we have to widen our CDR portfolio and make use of other land-intensive CDR options, or also be more ambitious on decarbonizing in other sectors that have nothing to do with CDR deployment in case these options have not been fully exploited yet. Then it's also important to note that while many of the model consensus on CDR deployment in biodiversity areas would bring negative effects, there's also some potential for positive co-benefits, specifically for habitat restoration, which can improve the connectivity, for example, or also the size of habitats. And here it's quite important to prioritize the restoration of degraded ecosystems. So more restoring degraded ecosystems than actively afforesting land that has historically not been forest land, for example. And then lastly, before I want to close, I want to highlight that this work is not intended to only criticize IAMs and IAM-produced scenarios. I think IAMs and scenarios have great value in highlighting what could still be feasible, how we could achieve certain targets, or in other words, what would need to happen to still achieve the 1.5 target. And I think the purpose of the study is really to inform future scenario modeling, to allow modeling communities to producing more biodiversity sensitive scenarios that are then ultimately, hopefully, more informative and more relevant for policy making. With that, I stop sharing my screen and hand back to Daniela.
Thank you, Ruben. This is a really interesting analysis, and I really enjoy reading your paper. I have a couple of questions, but before I saw that there are some clarifying questions on the methodology in the chat. So let's get to those first, and then if we have time, we go to more the questions that are other questions that we have. The first question is from David Tirelli. How are compared the shares of remaining refugia in the net effect, avoided warming, land allocation? Was it adopted square meter unit?
So basically what we do is we compare the relative loss of remaining refugia. It has to be noted that for different scenarios, like different shares of refugia would be remain, but we look at the amount of refugia that would still be present for a certain time step or a certain scenario. And then we look into how much more would have been lost if we were to exclude CDR. And then we compare this to the land allocation for CDR. So in short, to answer the question, we look at the relative benefits and the relative losses, and then we compare whether the relative loss is larger or smaller than the relative benefit. We do this spatially explicitly, so basically we could also do this on a square meter basis, but we aggregate this and state the results in relative terms because I think relative shares mean more than numbers for this comparison.
Thank you. And the second question is from Philip Johnson. It's related to basically how BECCS is modeled in the non-annexed countries, because it says that there are a lot of different conditions and requirements for BECCS to be developed in non-annexed countries versus annexed one country. So just to clarify if BECCS is modeled in non-annexed countries as well, right?
Yeah, so this is definitely the case. We see BECCS deployment in many different regions globally. Generally, we focus only on energy crop-based BECCS because in principle, BECCS could also be achieved with forest residues or organic waste materials. This would potentially reduce the land pressure, but this is not the case here. We only focus on energy crops for BECCS. And basically, the modeling data that we use is based on like a cost-effective optimization where different areas are allocated to deploy energy or to deploy energy crops. And but I also have to say that the data that we are using is quite broad brush, so this allows us to give us a global picture, but we don't have so detailed information in terms of different feedstocks, which is why this is really just a global snapshot that can indicate where we see overlaps, whether the overlaps may be more on the positive or more on the negative sides. But if you're interested in results for very specific regions, then I think our study can only be a starting point for further, more nuanced and more small local scale analyses.
Yeah, thank you. And third question and last clarifying question here. Actually, it's a two question. Uh, do you know what informs the IPCC hotspots? Are they drawn on the EPAT databases or
So the biodiversity hotspot
yeah?
definition, we follow the biodiversity hotspot definition in our study, and the biodiversity hotspot definition combines the G200 ecoregions. So this is a global data set showing different ecoregions, and this is like one of the data sets, and the second data set for the hotspots is the biodiversity hotspots for conservation priorities. This is based on a Nature paper from a couple of years back, which has been updated several times in recent years. And yeah, this is further described in the IPCC, but basically the hotspots then are an indicator of both biodiversity richness and also high levels of endemism.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question, I think I already touched on that, but just to confirm, the feedstocks that BECCS were modeled, it's only energy crops. Yes, right.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think those are the clarifying questions, and then if we have time, I'll go back to the other questions. But from the questions that I have, the first one for you, Ruben. I think your paper is really interesting, bringing this perspective of this risk-risk comparison, right? So for us so to avoid one risk of climate change, we are going to deploy CDR, but then we're going to end up doing another risk to the biodiversity. And I think it's really interesting to see the effect that you have on the net harm versus the net benefit, depending a lot of on the assumptions that you have behind that to really basically one assumption, like for example, the assumption that the climate refugia will recover after peak warming if we deploy CDR or not, this could completely change the signal to net benefit to net harm. Um, and with that in mind, in this context, thinking on an academic perspective, and I think your paper is really good academic contribution, how do you see it guiding future development in scenarios within IAMs when we think about land intensity CDR, if you want to prioritize biodiversity preservation?
Yeah, so I think in terms of future scenario development, our study can definitely highlight current land allocation patterns in the models, also identify the agreement of the different models, and then highlight that in many cases, the current land allocation patterns may be negative from a biodiversity standpoint. I think here it's important to note that the data that we are using is from the original SSP quantification. So the original quantification of these flagship scenarios, this is very valuable because they are widely used. But it has also been noted that since then, the IAM community has already progressed and broadened the portfolio of CDR options. So in the scenarios that we see in the latest assessment cycle by the IPCC, most CDR was still achieved through forestation, so afforestation and reforestation, and through BECCS, so two land-intensive options. There was already some direct air capture with carbon capture and storage, but little other options. And in the more recent scenarios, we see that more and more other CDR options are being modeled in the IAMs. So generally, IAMs broaden the portfolio of CDR options, and this is a good thing because this allows us to balance out some of the negative implications of the land-intensive options. Here, it's important to note that also some of the other options that are being modeled, they are also not silver bullets because they are either speculative, energy intensive, or very costly. And therefore, it's quite clear that we will need a portfolio that helps us to balance out the different drawbacks, but also opportunities of different CDR options. So I think there's already a lot being done in the modeling community. And as I said, I think the study can help working on the land allocation patterns, which would mean that potentially, yeah, models have to change their land allocation to also resort to less cost-effective places, while still making sure that this has not negative implications for food security or other aspects that we value, such as land tenure, for example. I think there are more things to say, but I'll leave it here for now, and then we can follow up if you expect a more specific answer.
Yeah, I think I can follow up, but this question is related to that, and I want also to hear from Sabine your perspective, not so much academic, but thinking about like what practically we can do politically, and it's very interesting that you show that if we decide to prioritize biodiversity, you could exclude 50% of the land for CDR, right? But this does not necessarily mean that 50% of the CDR would be decreased by 50%, because as you mentioned, we can prioritize other CDRs options that could be more sustainable, right? Sustainable with a big here. But how do you had touched on that, on how your paper can help to guide to come up with more sustainable CDR options, but do you or Sabine have some concrete measures or recommendations to guide such sustainable deployment of CDR if we as a society decide that it's important to preserve biodiversity, which I am all to that. So I wanted to hear from Sabine and Ruben.
Yeah, maybe I'll give it a start and then Ruben can complement. So this is of course something that we are relatively silent about in the paper. We don't develop any mechanisms on the basis of the research findings that we get from the analysis. But it's very clear that we regard these results as a kind of basis in order to do so in follow-up work. And I think there was also a question going into that direction in the Q&A box, kind of like, yeah, seeing it a little bit critically, how to integrate CDR, for instance, into emissions trading, carbon credits, and so on. And yes, I mean, there has been a lot of pushback, especially in the forest sector on forest credits. We've all seen the scandals around some of the credits and so on. What we do see, though, on the demand side as well, is an increasing demand also for high quality credits. And these are not only the more permanent ones or the more yeah, or the ones with that refer just to the CO2 removals, but also the ones that yeah, kind of fulfill other sustainability criteria. For instance, avoiding indirect land use change or threats to biodiversity, for that matter. So in that sense, I think the analysis does deliver quite interesting results in order to inform these kind of things, right? You could think of the debates that were alluded to, right? How would you formulate standards or features that credits would need to have? But you could also think about direct regulation, right? For instance, the EU and the CRCF was mentioned, which is the framework of the EU for CDR, accounting for the CDR. But you could also think about the Renewable Energy Directive, right? Kind of like putting some regulations, or you could think about quotas on biomass imports, and so on and so on. Ruben may have more ideas, but I think what we're doing in the analysis is kind of delivering the input to this. The mechanisms still need to be developed, and I think people are thinking about this. And the next step would sort of be to bring this together. Ruben, I don't know, sorry, I jumped first.
No, that was good. I think I don't have much to add to this. Um, I think just one more point that relates to that, but also to Daniela's previous question about like what models can do to further improve scenarios to make them more biodiversity sensitive. So I think what's important to note is that what we did here is we did not produce or run any scenarios. We basically do a post assessment of already existing scenarios. And I think this is already partly being done as part of AR7. So the next IPCC cycle is that such sustainability considerations should not be post assessments, but they should be considered directly when the scenarios are being produced. And results should also be transparently documented and reported, which allows then users of such scenarios or other researchers to also better understand the sustainability implications of scenarios directly without requiring such post assessments. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. but I think efforts have been started that are going in this direction to consider biodiversity, but also other aspects of biodiversity directly in the model and not ex post.
Thank you. Very insightful. The other question that I had, I think Sabine already touched a little bit on that. It was related to the financial mechanism for that. So I wanted to put you in the spot there. I know that you've been thinking a lot about the question of permanence and discount factors for permanence. You've been cooking a paper on that. And spoiler alert, we're going to be presenting in the future webinars this paper. But I want to, how do you think that a discount factor for biodiversity loss could be applied? Is that the way to go, or like a premium, or do you think that we shouldn't go that route to basically put more pressure on nature to give us this, by nature to give us the solution? What do you think is the, I wanted to hear a little bit more your perspective specifically on that question, on this high quality credits that you mentioned. How do you view that in the current situation of the carbon market? Sorry to put you on the spot. I know it's a very tricky question.
No, that's fair enough. Because we already started to discuss it a little bit previously, and it's actually also not a new discussion, right? If you remember the discussions in the negotiations around reduced emissions of deforestation and degradation, RED plus, back in the days, that idea was already floated back then, right? To have premiums back then it was avoided emissions or emissions reductions that came also with co-benefits for biodiversity. So in that sense, it's a super relevant debate that has been going on for a while. But I think that we should also not forget about the other instruments I was just mentioning very briefly, right? Because especially as deforestation is ongoing, and as we have, as we see a lot of the forest falling, and then being also at risk from increased climate change. I'm talking about increased disturbances, for instance, in the context of wildfires, pests like bark beetles, windthrow, and what have you. I think in that context, we may actually also want to rely, especially in the short term, on before CDR credits have been introduced into carbon trading properly and so on, and the monitoring, reporting, and verification has also expanded enough in order to also cover biodiversity sufficiently. So in this situation, I think it's important to also sometimes not forget that we also have means of directly regulating and putting, for instance, quotas or import restrictions or what I was mentioning in the context of the EU, the Renewable Energy Directive that also has sustainability criteria and so on for biomass. So I think we shouldn't forget that in the run up. To including the CDR credits into carbon trading more and more, that we also have these instruments at our disposal to protect the forest and to make sure that we don't produce a threat to biodiversity beyond what Ruben was showing us is already coming from climate change itself.
Yeah, I agree. And especially because one of your key results also this difference between the Annex 1 and non-Annex countries and how the burden will be on non-Annex countries. And this can just enhance these questions of fairness and enhancing justice that was already practiced historically, right? Those are the questions that I had. I see that there are a couple of questions in the comments, so I'll go over them. A question from Gopal. In IPCC 7, AR7 is considered CDR model with priority.
I think I can take that one if you allow.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's true that in the past, if you look at the last assessment cycle, CDR was a bit of a topic that was a little bit fragmented over the IPCC reports, even though all the different working groups dealt with it. Also because of its increasing importance. It was a little bit here and there in the cross-cutting chapter, in the AFOLU chapter, and so on. But actually, in AR7, so the new assessment cycle, in working group 3, there is a dedicated chapter for carbon dioxide removal. So it's true that they're giving it more attention right now, and it's also still an important topic, of course, that features in the other working groups. So I think that perception is right. And it's probably also due to the fact that CDR is gaining more prominence as we've almost used up our carbon budget for at least to comply with the Paris targets. So it's no longer just important in the context of reaching net zero on time, but also to manage overshoot. That's quite imminent.
Yeah, maybe just to add to this, I think what we are seeing, like I think what we can definitely expect is that the AR7 scenarios will also quite heavily make use of CDR. I think compared to AR6, there will probably be a more comprehensive assessment of sustainability implications. For example, looking more closely into biodiversity, but also other aspects. But as Sabine already said, due to foregone emission reductions in recent years, the models will need to deploy more and more CDR as well to still limit warming to 1.5. So I think there's like this challenge of making sure that scenarios or CDR use in scenarios is more sustainable, while we will still also need more if we want to still limit warming to the same limits, since we just were not ambitious enough in the years since the last scenarios were published.
Yeah, thank you. There is a comment from Philip Johnson. Actually, is a clarifying comment from his question, because he's saying that it's probably very challenging for some countries, some global south countries, low-income countries especially, to deploy BECCS. And in the models, BECCS is deployed even in low-income countries. They may lack infrastructure. And I think this speaks to the question of feasibility, which not the IAMs don't always capture that, right? But do you have any comments on the feasibility of deploying BECCS in these low-income countries? And it's not related to your paper, but if you have any comment to
Yeah.
Philip.
So yeah, as you said, I think our paper is a bit agnostic to this question
Mhm.
because we are just working with scenario outputs and then further process these outputs. I think in terms of BECCS, it's important to know that our paper mainly looks at the land that would be required for the energy crops that are dedicated for BECCS. But this does not mean that like if energy cropland is being allocated in one country, that the capturing process or the energy production and the capturing process would also take place in the same country. So there are different assumptions across the different models regarding biomass trade and so on. I think it goes beyond this presentation to further unpack these, but I think the value is also the value of our multi-model approach is that all these models model the same scenarios. They have like the same broad picture results, but they still have different assumptions about how technologies are modeled. And having these different assumptions, these different approaches across the different models allow us then also to come to more robust conclusions, simply because they pursue different pathways.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thanks for clarifying. Any comment on that, Sabine, or?
No, that was perfect.
Okay. Yeah, we have just a couple of minutes, and I wanted to just leave it open if you have any final comments on that or any that you want to share. Otherwise, I think we can finish the webinar. No?
I don't know, Sabine, if you have something to add. I think I pretty much said or highlighted the different key takeaways. Just to reiterate, I think scenarios are
Yeah.
really quite important, and yeah, I think there's a lot to be done to further improve scenarios to consider sustainability implications more centrally in scenario modeling, and hopefully our study can make a contribution there so that future scenarios will remain highly policy relevant, and yeah, may more centrally consider also the goal in the Paris Agreement to achieve the climate targets, not just the warming targets, but also the Paris Agreement holistically, which says that
Mm.
we need to implement the agreement in line with sustainable development.
In the meantime, I do think, though, that it's still important to also, perform the kind of analyses that Ruben has been doing to kind of, expose process things and sort of like see the implications, and then also inform these improvements in modeling that Ruben was talking about. Also because I think oftentimes it's happening that we look at different constraints, and we keep constraining our potentials, our scope for deployments more and more. But then we kind of like comparing also apples and oranges, because if we don't remove the CO2, then, for instance, in this case, biodiversity will also be at risk. So I think it's important to also continue, framing more of these risk comparisons in the analyses in
Yeah.
order to get valid conclusions. And I think, Ruben, you will probably need to get back to Gareth because he wants to have a discussion on feedstocks.
Happy
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah, I saw that, but it seems like a much longer discussion than the 2 minutes that we have.
No,
So
that's assessment.
sorry, Garrett. Yeah, thank you all. So with that, we can finish the webinar. I really want to thank you, the panelists and the speaker, and everyone that joined. And stay tuned for the next webinar in January. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.